Okay, class, in this last section we're going to talk about bone. So, again, similar format. Let's talk about molecular composition. So, bone is composed about 50 to 70% of mineral components, 20 to 40% organic matrix, 5 to 10% water, and less than 3% are lipids. The primary function of the mineral component is to provide that rigidity and load-bearing strength, and it's primarily composed of hydroxypatate, which is a combination of calcium and phosphorus. Again, why you might think of like calcium and phosphorus, why they're like always in like bone health supplements, like that's kind of why. The organic matrix, which provides a little bit of the elasticity and flexibility to bone. If you've ever held like a fresh bone, for example, you'll see that it does bend a little bit. And that's primarily type 1 collagen. Now, bone mass itself, like the amount of bone you have, only accounts for about 50 to 70% of bone strength. The remainder comes from geometry. So potentially half comes from the unique layout of bone. A lot of it's due to the expansion of the radius, right, or radial expansion of bone, the appositional growth, which can increase the strength of bone to the fourth power. So again, like the mass matters, the geometry probably matters as well too, about equally. And as we'll see, that a lot of that is contingent upon the remodeling process in bones. So like making sure that that we're constantly adding in new bone and removing old bone. Now here's a layout again of looking at compact bone, right? So we've got and spongy bone or cancellous bone. So we've got our layout here. So compact bone consists of closed packed osteons or Haverian systems. Let me get my pen here. The osteon consists of a central canal called the osteotonic or Haverian canal, which is surrounded by concentric rings of lamellae. Lamellae matrix, and between the rings of matrix, the bone cells or osteocytes are located within these spaces called the lacunae, analogous to what we saw with our chondrocytes. Now, small channels or caniculi radiate from the lacunae to the osteotonic canal, providing passageways through the hardened matrix. In compact bone, the Haverian systems are tightly tacked together to form what appears to be almost a solid mass. The osteotonic canals contain blood vessels that are parallel to the long axis of the bone, which you kind of see here, right? And these blood vessels interconnect by way of perforating canals within the vessels of the surface vessels. Here's kind of an example, or Volkmann's canal. Now, the periosteum is a fibrous connective tissue sheath that surrounds the outer cortical layer of bone, except at joints, where we see the articular cartilage, kind of obviously, which contain blood vessels, nerve fibers, and osteoblasts, which kind of support the bone. The periosteum is tightly attached to the outer cortical surface of the bone by thick collagenous fibers called Sharpey's fibers, which extend into underlying bone. Now, osteoblasts and osteocytes are the cells that produce the extracellular matrix and are responsible for its mineralization. Osteocytes represent terminally differentiated osteoblasts and function within networks to support bone structure metabolism. So it's almost analogous to what we saw in the cartilage, right? Osteoblasts produce the matrix, right? Once they enter into the lacunae and are surrounded by the matrix, they become osteocytes. So in cartilage, you have chondroblasts, right? And chondrocytes. Chondrocytes are basically just mature chondroblasts within the lacunae. Osteocytes are essentially osteoblasts that are mature and now contained within the matrix, right? In this example, it's bone. So osteocytes form dendritic processes that extend out from their cell bodies into spaces called the caniculi we talked about earlier. And these dendritic processes, or through them, the osteocytes form these networks to interface with other osteocytes to kind of regulate and maintain the extracellular matrix, which in this example is bone. So osteoclasts originate from hemopoietic stem cells, HSCs, which are a little bit different than the MSCs, right? So slightly different. Osteoclasts break down bone or resorb bone by dissolving or degrading the hydroxypatate and other organic material, releasing calcium into the blood, which we'll talk about. It's pretty important for a few different things. Now, bone formation by osteoblasts and resorption by osteoclasts is a tightly regulated process. It's ongoing throughout our lives, right? It's responsible for continuous bone modeling. In fact, we remodel about 10% of our bone every year. And in fact, if you extend it over a decade, most reports suggest you have completely new bone within 10 years in a healthy system. Now, bone growth, we've got, well, probably a better phrase is we've got multiple different types of bone adaptations. Bone growth is one that occurs during adolescence and childhood, where we have like either longitudinal or radial growth along an epiphyseal and metaphyseal areas, where again we have that cartilage, which eventually mineralizes and forms new bone. Again, like this is not like something that occurs long term, but it's worth mentioning that this is part of the processes of bone. Bone modeling is a process by which bones change their overall shape in response to mechanical forces, which lead to a gradual change, even like the shape in a certain sense, an orientation or axis of the bone. You might think of like Wolff's Law when we're thinking about this, where like we have that long-term adaptation to applied stresses. So now one thing to note that like bone modeling is a lot less frequent than remodeling, which we'll talk about in a little bit. In fact, the vast majority of bone modeling is really just an overflow of remodeling rather than like brand new modeling. It's what most reports kind of suggest. We'll talk about remodeling in a bit. And here's an example here of just a bone mass, again, saying that like, okay, we have growth, right? Increase in mass, the total amount, up until through adolescence until adulthood, and then we start seeing a gradual reduction. We'll talk about kind of what happens. So bone remodeling, even begins before birth and continues really until death. And again, it's through this like tightly relationship between osteoclasts and osteoblasts that one osteoclasts resorb old bone, and then osteoblasts form new bone. Bone modeling increases in perimenopausal and early postmenopausal women, and then slows further with aging. And we think bone remodeling increases mildly in aging men. So it's a process by which we renew and maintain bone strength and mineral homeostasis. Right, it's the essentially same process, both in cortical or trabecular bone. And again, it involves a removal of old bone and replacement with new bone matrix and new mineralization. By resorbing old bone and forming new bone, we prevent accumulation of bone microdamage. Like I mentioned, the mass matters, but so does the geometry. If we've got healthy bone, like that provides a lot of the strength, right? So we constantly want to be remodeling. And after bone formation, about 50 to 70% of osteoblasts undergo apoptosis, with like the balance becoming osteocytes within the bone lining cells. So there are some important regulators of bone remodeling. Calcitonin, a hormone released by the thyroid gland in response to hypercalcemia, which lowers the serum calcium by inhibiting bone resorption by osteoclasts. So the calcitonin, right? We have hypercalcemia. We want to take in more of it into the bone. Parathyroid hormone does kind of the opposite. Its main function is to maintain blood calcium homeostasis. So if we have too low of it, the parathyroid release parathyroid hormone, and indirectly will stimulate osteoclasts by inhibiting the secretion of osteoprotegrin, which is kind of a thing that inhibits osteoclasts. So by inhibiting osteoprotegrin, or we often call it a bone protector, kind of like the Greek word for it, or the translation of the Greek term, by inhibiting this, we allow osteoclasts to kind of do their thing and release calcium into the blood. Vitamin D3, which is synthesized by the skin, liver, and kidneys. So in the presence of sunlight, like vitamin D is created by, is synthesized by the skin. It's called calciferol. Um, and then the liver converts calciferol to calcidol, which is then converted to calcitrol in the kidney. So you have those three things work well. It's kind of why like it's like alcohol not super great for a lot of things. It's also not great for your bones too, because you have really bad liver function. You have bad bone health. And estrogen inhibits bone resorption by directly inducing apoptosis of this osteoclast. So it's why we see potentially later down the road postmenopausal issues with um, issues with issues with bone health in older women in particular because of the lack of estrogen. And then here's just an example again of that bone remodeling process here. So again, bone remodeling is a replacement of old bone with new bone and continues throughout life. And again, so much like the whole skeleton is replaced every 10 years. So again, we've got, resorption by our osteoclasts begins when osteoclasts remove a portion of the old bone, replaced later by, osteoblasts. And then osteoblasts lay down collagen and mineral deposits, which were previously remodeled by osteoclasts. And osteoblast activity is vital for maintaining bone mineral density. So again, it's this constant breakdown of osteoclast, again, and then reformation. And here's another kind of example of that here too, looking at this again. Activation by osteoclast, breakdown, reversal, formation, and then quiescence where the bone osteoblasts become resting and then start lining. And then, some of them are formed into osteocytes contained within the lacunae. And there's another just kind of graph of that as well here too. Well, that's all I have for our connective tissue lecture. Again, you'll get more of this later on, but it's just important to kind of get into understanding what's going on here, remembering these phases of tissue remodeling. All right, we'll end it here. Take care.